I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
And I'm your other co-host, Dean Deloff.
Hey, you might have heard some really good news this week about what's been going on in Bolivia. What's the deal with Bolivia? A Jerry Seinfeld type character might ask. Well, if you'll recall, there was a really bad coup there not too long ago in 2019 that ousted everyone's favorite Bolivian president, Evo Morales, and ousted also the movement towards socialism, the political party that was in power there. But hey, there were some elections, and things are looking pretty good at the moment. Luis Arceo, who is a member of the movement towards socialism, is now the president. Would you fancy that?
Yeah, would you fancy it? It is pretty exciting, especially after what was a lot of very bad news in the last year in Bolivia. So it's set a lot of people off on a big celebratory moment, and that's exciting. And to talk more about it, we have Jim Hodgson with us, who is kind of our de facto Magnificast Latin America correspondent, I guess. That's what he has become on the show, and we're very grateful for the perspective he brings. We mentioned this a few times in the show, but if you want a little more background, we did an episode with Jim last year, right after the coup itself. So you can maybe listen to that, hear a little bit more about Bolivia and some other parts of Latin America there, and get a little more background on what the lead up to this has been, what the mood was like a year ago. We also did an episode with Jim on Venezuela before that one, quite a long time ago, which may also be of interest because Venezuela is heading into elections in December as well. So as much information as you can possibly gather on these complicated places, that is what you should do. You get the idea. You know what I'm trying to say. Jim, grateful to have him back again, and his perspective is always a unique one for Christians on the left. Let's go over to Jim. Jim, you've been on the show twice before. We're really glad to have you back. And also, it's nice to have you back talking about something more positive or uplifting than the previous times. We had you on talking about the presidential election in Venezuela, where Maduro had won, and sort of the events ensuing after that. And then almost a year ago, talking about the coup in Bolivia. So for listeners who don't know you already and maybe haven't heard those episodes, could you say a little bit about yourself? What do you do? What's your experience in the region? Why are you invested in what's happening in a place like Bolivia?
Thanks. It's really a delight to be back with you on the Magnificast and to share with your listeners some thoughts about a part of the world that I really love. I've been back and forth between Canada and Latin America pretty much constantly since 1983. So it's a part of who I am, and I think my background is in journalism. But I spent the last 20 years working for the United Church of Canada as their coordinator for Latin America partnerships and issues and so on. So, but in all those years, 37 years of work back and forth in Latin America. I've only made 2 visits to Bolivia. And those were, not that long ago, 2011 and 2015. So after the the new experiment had begun and was well underway, and of course before the coup a year ago.
Thanks, Jim. That's some helpful context about who you are and why you're such a good person to talk to about this. Maybe we can just jump right into it. Can you give us a recap of the recent events in Bolivia? Like, how did we get to this point? The basics are that there was a coup, but the people voted and undid it. But how would you characterize, like, what happened in Bolivia and, what's been going on there?
I guess I'm thrilled by the election result. I feared something more ambiguous. This is a resounding recovery of power by the progressive forces in Bolivia. So, like, to go back a little bit, Bolivia is one of those countries that was plagued for decades by military dictatorships, and kind of began to turn towards, a sort of democracy in 1989. But then those governments sputtered. They were trying to be neoliberal in a neoliberal world, following the dictates of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the U.S. government and so on. But the majority of the people in Bolivia are indigenous. Most were locked out of whatever economic experiment was going on amongst the middle class of the rich. Lighter-skinned people, kind of in the lowlands of Bolivia, not the highlands where the indigenous people lived. And so there was this constant effort to try to get governments to pay attention. And there was a man named Evo Morales who headed a social movement of people who grew coca leaves, grew coca for a living. And coca is, yes, it is the product from which cocaine is made, but that's a distortion of the use of coca historically in the Andean region. Coca eases hunger. It helps you contend with the altitude. It helps you feel a bit better in cold weather, and so on. And it has deep roots in the culture of Andean peoples. The distortions that come with drug trafficking and so on are a different issue. But there was an effort by the U.S. government to suppress coca production in Bolivia, and that affected farmers. Like, if you can't grow coca, then what are you supposed to do? What are the alternatives? And there was never an alternative presented. So Morales headed this social movement and became a nationally known, globally known, as a spokesperson for small farmers. So he organized a new political movement after a series of these conservative or neoliberal governments had kind of collapsed because of their own internal contradictions. And so Morales won the election in December 2005. And then, like some of the other progressive parties, when they took power, realized that the constitution had to change. So there was a new constitution proposed in 2007, approved in 2009. And Morales moved forward with things like nationalization of the energy system, reorganizing the mining industry. Some of that is still privately owned, but some of it is publicly owned, and so on. So Morales, elected in December 2005, was the president until November 2019. So that's almost 14 years. And this was a time of, I think, great progress in Bolivia. And it shows what can be done when a government decides to reorient the resources of the nation towards the benefit of the impoverished majority. And it does mean some restrictions on what the rich can do, on what wealthy people can do. But so be it. He mostly tried to do the right things to bring about a better life for most people in the country. Now, another impression I had of Bolivia in those two visits I made in 2011, 2015 was that politics had become kind of normal. Like it wasn't like before you had to go to the streets to make your point, or organize a national strike to make your point. You could have a reasonable debate with government, with other sectors about environmental policies, about specific policy options. You know, there was a big fight over building a highway through a national park, protected indigenous land, and you know the back and forth over that. Yeah, they did have to take to the streets to get the government to hear. But I think that was a good moment in Bolivia in the Morales years, was when people challenged the government and said, you know, look, what you're proposing isn't working for us. And I think you could say, like from outside, you know, people made criticisms of Bolivia that, you know, I think merit some attention. So one of them was that the government of Bolivia hadn't done enough to step away from dependence on resource extraction for the wealth of the nation. And the answer is a little bit, well, what are we supposed to do? You know, that's what we have. We have resources that the rest of the world wants to buy, you know, oil, gas, minerals, tin, infamously. And, you know, and so as we try to create an economy that is more just for people, and that may produce other economic alternatives into the future, we have to rely on resource extraction for the short term. The same comment was made about a lot of the so-called pink wave governments in the you know, sort of like from 2000 to 2015 or so, that they hadn't done enough to step away from resource extraction. But again, their response was, well, we kind of don't have a choice here. We're at the bottom end of the global economy, and you know, give us a chance to get on our feet. So anyway, all of that kind of went along. There were debates about expanding rights for women, LGBTI people. That new constitution in 2007 actually defined marriage as being between a man and a woman, and so that seemed to block further progress on inclusion for LGBT people. So those kinds of issues continue to be argued about. But what happened in after the election in October, November 2019 came as a surprise. You know, the votes were counted. The count was interrupted. When the counting continued, the OAS, the Organization of American States, cast doubt on the results and on the process. And then there was this whole kind of electronic media campaign that you know, like later was found to be you know bots and lies, you know, that cast doubt on the whole process. And so things kind of, you know, the outside pressure, the pressure from the wealthy elites and so on, and then the military finally pushed Evo Morales to leave Bolivia. He went first to Mexico and later Argentina, so as to protect the people that were his supporters from further violence. So then you'll remember those stunning scenes of the coup leaders going into the cathedral going into the National Palace, carrying a huge Bible. So there's this kind of restoration, a sense of restoration by the whites and the wealthy people, taking power back from the indigenous people, reimposing a kind of a colonial notion of Christianity on the country, as if the indigenous people weren't also Christians of a different sort. And so, like, I think the process for the past year was for that right-wing coup government of Jeanine Áñez, as the interim president, like try to force itself or reimpose an old style authoritarian rule in Bolivia. And their hope going into the election was, well, first with Agnes herself, but it was pretty obvious she wouldn't win. So then they threw their weight behind a guy named Carlos Mesa, who had been president before Evo Morales, and was one of those unsuccessful presidents in the early part of the 2000s. And so this election happened. Mas won. It was pretty clear from exit polling that he had won. And the Mas is the Movement Towards Socialism, the political party. And he won convincingly. I mean, I think the official results have been slowly coming out, but the official results have him just above 50% of the vote. So there we are. We've got this surprising victory, and it seems to be accepted so far by the other parties and the OAS itself.
Thanks, Jim. That is a fantastic long view of Bolivia that I think helps us contextualize what's happening in just recent days, weeks. I wondered, you've spent so much time in this region, and in 2002 or 2004 and 2, some kind of similar events happened in Venezuela, where Hugo Chavez in 2002 was removed from office by the military in a coup and then restored to power just a couple days later. In 2004, he survived a recall referendum, which you saw as an election observer there. So, you're in touch with these kinds of dynamics. Again, people can find out lots more about Venezuela by listening to some older episodes we've done with Jim. But I'm curious, having gone through that, does this return of the Mas to power after this coup attempt in Bolivia remind you at all of those kinds of events in Venezuela? What does it tell you about the power of these social movements? What does it mean that the people of Bolivia chose in such overwhelming force to restore the Mas to government?
Yeah, fascinating, isn't it? It's what happened in 2002 with that coup attempt against Chavez was interesting. I mean, it just took 3 or 4 days of street protests for the other side to back off and bring him back. And then, of course, as you say, there was the recall referendum. There was also a recall referendum against Evo Morales. When was that? Around 2007 or 8. So those are democratic tactics. The coup is not a democratic tactic, but those recall referendums are features of the new constitutions that the people can organize a plebiscite. You get a long list of signatures, and then demand a recall referendum, and so that happened in both countries. And in each case, Chavez won in Venezuela in 2004, and Morales won again. Defeated the recall referendum, and I've forgotten which year that was, 2007 or so. Anyway, so having recovered power, the people in a sense recover power. What will happen now? And I mean, so we could take a look at the guy who won, whose name is Luis Arceo, or he's called Lucho. And he's an interesting guy. He's not indigenous. He's an economist, and he was the minister of finance and the architect of the changes to the economy in Bolivia throughout most of the past 14 years. Those are years of pretty steady economic growth and reduction of poverty and great improvement on inequality, and then moving to trying to shift the economy just from extraction resources to actually some industry built around them. So he's an economist, an intellectual. He studied in England at Warwick University, has a master's degree in economics. So he kind of represents one part of the MAS, the Movement Towards Socialism political party. His running mate is a man named David Choque Huanca, who is indigenous, and he kind of represents the other side of the MAS, and he is closer to the world from which emerged Evo Morales himself, close to the social movements, and he's somebody who kind of represents the indigenous imagination of the vivir bien, or good living, in Aymara, the Suma Camaña, it's called. This indigenous notion that we should live well on the earth, and not in opposition, in a way of destroying it. So David Choquehuanca is much more much more the inheritor of the sort of the indigenous mystique that Evo Morales carried with him. Arce will be, I think, a very competent leader. He's given a couple of interviews. He says the first thing that he will do is offer, he calls it a bono, which in a sense means coupon, but a kind of a payment to people as they contend with the COVID-19 pandemic. I think the next thing that he may do, though, is going to cause some concern, which may be a kind of an austerity program. But that's at the same time as he's kind of looking at austerity, because again, there aren't very many alternatives, as he says. He's also demanded a 2-year suspension of payment on Bolivia's national debt, and I think that something I might draw your attention to is, I think, like, not just in Bolivia but around the world, the demands for suspension of debt repayments have surged to the surface again 20 years after they kind of subsided a bit because interest rates dropped so much. Anyway, so the debt is again on everybody's agenda, and the IMF, the World Bank, the G20, the banks globally, they're all hearing the demands from countries like Bolivia for suspension of debt repayment. And so there have been some, I think, tinkering with payment schedules, but not enough. And so Arce will be kind of key in that struggle over how debt is managed. Again, he's called for a 2-year suspension. I think the most that the IMF and World Bank and G20 have offered is, well, first of all, it was to the end of this year. Now it looks like it's towards the middle of next year. Private banks, of course, will have nothing to do with that kind of conversation, but there is, a lively conversation going on with the international financial institutions, and we can look at Arce as key in that. He'll be a leader.
That's all really fascinating. I'm interested to see how those policies really shake out for people on the ground. Well, I want to turn back to something that you just said a minute ago. You mentioned that there are these, two sides of MAS represented in the presidential candidates. That reminds me of something that you said to us last year when we spoke about the coup. You mentioned that the MAS struggled to maintain a lot of the different partnerships and like mobilized bases after the election of Evo Morales, which was a strength and a liability in its own way. But does it seem like MAS has won some of that back, or I don't know what's going on there? How did they remobilize their base after the coup?
Yeah, fascinating. I think that they rebuilt a coalition because people, I mean, if the right wing had been less, here I go again, giving advice to the right wing, but if they had been less stupid about how they took power, that whole symbolic march into the National Palace with the giant Bible, they might have they might have actually presented a realistic alternative, but that wasn't what they wanted to do. It was all very triumphalistic, neo-colonial. So people who had been alienated perhaps by the mass being slow on, say, women's issues or ecological issues. The failure to move fast enough to build economic alternatives, and so on. If you care about the environment, if you care about justice for women, for human rights, for indigenous rights, even minimally, then you weren't going to get anything like that from the people who supported the coup. So people who may not have voted for Mas in 2019, I think voted for them this time because they saw that the other side had nothing to offer them.
That makes sense. There's so much we could ask about the anatomy, I guess, of all of this, the people's movements and how things are shifting and recovering and all of that. But I fear we'll get too bogged down in the details. We have some other important questions to get to. Maybe we could pivot a little bit to talking about what this victory means for people on the left, and also what it's like to think about it as people who don't live in Bolivia and are just kind of observing all these things. There's a lot of responses from North Americans above Mexico, at least on Bolivia. One interesting point that's kind of popped up is how the Bolivian people voted out fascism, and that is taken by some to be a signal that people in the U.S. could also vote out, Donald Trump or fascism in the upcoming election. And at least for us, voting is fine and good, but this seems maybe like a sort of a false equivalence, and perhaps it's difficult to parse out what we can and can't analogize between these situations. So, maybe we could just start by getting your impression on that as we try to learn our own lessons from Bolivia. What do you think about those who compare, for instance, voting out Donald Trump and voting out Jeanine Áñez?
Yeah, interesting. I'd like to kind of maybe do two things. Like, what does it mean in the region in Latin America, and then I'll come to the Trump Áñez question. There are some parallels there, but in the region, I think this is where you've seen protests in Chile, Ecuador, Costa Rica, most recently. Over the policies of the pretty conservative governments, very, very persistent, long-lasting demonstrations in quite a few countries, and actually right now in Colombia, March by Indigenous People on the Capitol, a 2-day general strike. So the momentum or the resistance in Latin America, I think, will be strengthened by the victory. It gives people a lot of hope that the MAS has won power again in Bolivia. And then I think when you think about situations facing us in the north, the U.S. election is on now, and people, I think rightly are committed to getting rid of Trump. And I I'm a Canadian. It's not for me to tell people in the United States how to vote, but frankly, we kind of hope that Trump will be gone after this. At the same time, Biden is not Luis Arceo. He's going to be the head of the superpower. We've had some conversations around the edges about imperialism, and he's going to head the empire. So I think that the people, those of us who see Trump as the kind of the embodiment of fascism, or the open, having opened the door to really awful racist and militia-like movements in the United States. Stopping that is really important, but at the same time, we can't pretend that Biden will resolve all the problems. So the pressure has to stay on, and I think that's a lesson to take from Latin America. people in Latin America will still have to contend with U.S. imperialism, and people in the United States will still have to dismantle racism and militarism and colonialism and the capitalist system that undermines democracy. So like all those things those struggles will go on, and in a way, having the pressure, or this is what I think. Trump takes up way too much space in our brains. And that's something that Anya has tried to do with her Bible stunt and those other Christian symbols, was to try to occupy space in our brains. And no, we have to always be focused on what we want, what we are in favor of, and keep looking for ways to advance a people's agenda that reorients the instruments of power to the benefit of all.
Yeah, I think that's true. Not to mention, the folks in Bolivia in the MAS, they're organized in ways that the American left can only dream about. Now I want to turn to something that you said last time you were on the show about the preferential option for the poor. I think it was something that really stuck with Dean and I, so I thought it'd be a good thing to bring it back up. So, the preferential option for the poor, as people know, is a concept that comes from liberation theology. If you want to know more about that, listen to our show. Um, but the way that you've talked about it in the past helps us see that the poor can also have projects themselves, and it's important to affirm those projects. So, do you think that we can see Bolivia and the MAS as an expression of that preferential option for the poor? Um, would that be like a Christian way of trying to understand what's going on here?
Yeah, that's an interesting take, and there've been some moments in these past 14 years where Evo Morales and Francis drew close, and Pope Francis, I think, with his openness to indigenous spirituality and symbols, and to social movements, several times encountered Evo as an ally in those. And I know that the Pope called Evo after the election. I hope he also called Luis Arceo, the new president. Anyway, but yeah, I think liberation theology kind of describes a way of thinking about the world and including power relationships in the world, and puts an emphasis on thinking from the margins, from the people who've been locked out, the people who've been excluded, and what's going on there. And the preferential option for the poor is maybe a bit more of an institutional response to that kind of social ferment. So, the church talks about its preferential option for the poor, and the language is kind of it's picked up in Catholic social teaching and in the teaching of other churches too. So it's kind of two things. If you think about from the perspective of religious power or political power, what's gone on in Bolivia has been the poor made choices for political expression of their social movements or of their deepest desires. So they created a political party that won power, and won power several times again, and then won power again this week. So you may have questions or doubts, but you stand with the people who've made those choices about their own lives and say, I will stand with those people in their option because I made an option for them. I choose to believe what they say about their conditions and will support their efforts for change because justice demands that of me. So that's maybe where I would draw a bit of a distinction between the preferential option for the poor as a concept that's maybe more out of the institutions, and liberation theology, which is kind of like the other side of the page, or the same, the other reading. Liberation theology emerges from the margins and from the grassroots and from a deep reflection on life in community, what's going on in our communities. So if people with power are listening, then they will stand with the poor in their choices. And that's something, of course, in practical terms, every day we see governments refusing to do. And I think we'll see it again in the next few months and years, that the United States, the banks, the International Monetary Fund, the people with power will do everything they can to try to undermine the choice of the Bolivian people. And it's up to the rest of us to stand in solidarity with the people as they make their choices about the future that they want to make.
I think that's a good word, trying to see people as making choices themselves, and what does it mean to be in solidarity with them. Well, what's great about having you on the show for this particular conversation, as we said at the top of the hour, is that usually, well, the past 2 times we've had you on the show, it's been to talk through what seems to be bad news, or at least complicated news, right? The efforts of the U.S. and Canada to intervene in Venezuela, and then the coup last year in Bolivia. And being a person on the left can be depressing, of course, especially if you live in the centers of power. But stories like Bolivia's are also very hopeful, at least in the last week. So how do you think Christians on the left, or leftists in general, can celebrate those victories? How do we sustain or build on that energy when things maybe aren't feeling as exciting or hopeful?
Yeah, I think we can take hope from the social movements in our midst. We see, again, in Canada, mobilization around Indigenous rights. This is sparked again by something that's happened in one place, rural Nova Scotia, over one issue, who can fish for lobster and when. But it's the same struggle that we saw at the beginning of this year in British Columbia, in a fight over a gas pipeline through Indigenous territory. We see the massive response in the United States and in Canada to racism. And the Black lives really do matter. When you think about the kind of social mobilization that brought Evo to power at the beginning and held him in power, and then returned the mass to power, the street marches and so on. They're not unlike what Black Lives Matter mustered in the May and June in the United States. So, look for hope in the social movements that you're part of. How to sort of knit alliances across sectors, and knowing that we won't always agree on everything, but like what can we do today that moves us all forward? So I think we should draw hope from these rare victories. It's not going to be easy in Bolivia. It's not going to be easy anywhere else. But I think that we'll see in the months ahead in Latin America some more victories. Those demonstrations in Chile are going to lead to, I think, a new constitution in Chile. Get rid finally of the Pinochet dictatorship era constitution in that country. Then we'll see what else can change. There's an election in December in Venezuela that is to replace the Congress. And I think, just if I can say a word about Venezuela, again, you see the global powers lined up against a complicated but generally progressive government that's been in power for 20 years in Venezuela. And it's a situation where governments like that of Canada and the United States seem to want to do anything except actually support dialogue as a means towards resolving conflict. It's very sad to see that Canada is still standing with that ridiculous coalition, the Lima group. in opposition to the elected, the people, the government that the people of Venezuela chose and have chosen successfully to govern them. So yeah, it's not going to be easy, but I think if we're wise on the left, then we will learn from mistakes and learn from the ways that that power has taken advantage of our divisions, to divide and rule us literally, and that we can find yet again some new ways of coming together to build alternatives that work for most of the people most of the time.
I feel we always end our conversations with you asking you a question about solidarity, and it just seems appropriate to talk about that here as well as we sort of near the end of the conversation. There were a lot of mobilization attempts to build solidarity with the people of Bolivia in the last year, which I guess have paid off in some respect, or maybe people feel vindicated, and that's so great and fantastic. One of those rare moments of celebration. But as you say, the solidarity work is not just overseas. There's all kinds of solidarity to be built in our own countries, where there's plenty of injustice happening here too. As somebody who's been involved in so many groups and around so many groups that are building solidarity, what do you think that, especially Christians on the left in a place like the United States or like Canada, what do you think that we might be able to learn from these experiments in solidarity and participation, and how might we build those kinds of strong voices for justice in our own country?
Yeah, solidarity is a word I love. How do we build alliances of solidarity across borders and across languages and everything else? It's a huge challenge, but we have some bodies that help us to do that, and there are opportunities all around us if we look for them. And so like in Canada, I'm proud to support organizations like Development and Peace that works really hard to build relationships north and south, or some of the other efforts of Canadian churches, the United Church, the Primates World Relief and Development Fund at the Anglican Church, and so on. And then in the United States, Church World Service and some of the others. So like there are some ways that people can get involved in those kinds of organizations, and if nothing else, support them with money that's always needed. They're very concrete expressions of what we've been talking about. But then also, like I think something that I try to do that helps keep me honest. Like I live, fairly comfortable, sort of middle class life in downtown Toronto, and at the same time, try to make some noise on behalf of the people I care about in Latin America and other parts of the world. But something that helps keep me honest in those struggles is engaging with people who are newcomers, new immigrants, especially refugees, especially people who end up here and seek protection, refugee claimants in Canada, and so I think like over these, I came back from Mexico in 2000, and I think since 2000 I've been always involved around the edges in refugee work, because it keeps me grounded in people's real lives. So supporting somebody who came to Canada from Honduras takes me deeply inside the struggles for life and justice in probably the country with the worst human rights violations in the hemisphere right now. So that's solidarity too. You while you're looking at those big picture struggles, try to have somebody in your life that is, honestly struggling with a really concrete issue. Whether it's refugees or whether it's the prison system or the States right now. voter suppression. How do you make sure that everybody gets to vote in that context right now? So like solidarity is built from our concrete lived experiences of struggle against the forces of oppression. What do we learn from those? Take it to a political realm. I love how you guys in this podcast encourage people to move from the sort of the religious space and into the political space. That our faith demands of us that we get involved politically, because somehow the political action is a social expression of the call to love one another. That's kind of what I think about solidarity.
Dang, that's a good word, Jim. I think that's a really instructive point to end on.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll hopefully talk to you again in December as we all look to Venezuela to see what happens there and are trying to make sense of everything that happens in the lead up to those events.
Yeah, I think I've got the things I want to do, and I have retired from that job at the United Church, but I'm still very active in a lot of different issues, and so I'm going to write to some politicians about those elections, because I think it's appalling to me that they dismiss elections before they've even happened. So it's anyway, there's work to be done.
Well, good luck with it, and we'll see you in the struggle in our own way too. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/the Magnificast. We also have a Redbubble store. We got shirts, we got stickers, we got shirts and stickers. Maybe a pin in there. Who knows? Who knows what Redbubble's got? I haven't looked in a little bit. Our intro music is by Amaria Armstrong, and our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next time.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive.